So this is about evangelization, evangelizing after the Cultural Revolution. I'm very happy to note the previous talks have such an optimistic view, and which I'm going to not contradict here at all. I'm actually naturally quite a pessimistic person, but I do think there are some grounds for optimism. So I hope this is the right kind of distance from the microphone. So I shall start. I think we've got the basically we're all here. So evangelization must take account of the culture of the people to be evangelized. One way to approach the conflict which has been taking place within the church over the last 60 years, the lifetime of the Latin Mass Society, is to think of it as an argument about what aspects of modern culture present the best entry points for evangelization. There is a school of thought that says that, whether we like it or not, modern people don't understand symbols and don't like hierarchy. And you see this very much in post-conciliar documents, discussions, and even to some extent in the documents of the Council. And for this reason, the Church must put forward an evangelizing effort that minimizes those things while offering them something that they do want. Other people point to cultural developments which indicate that there is a hunger for hierarchy and symbols, and the people will come running if we offer these things to them. So, obviously, evangelization must take account of what the church is like in herself, her own culture and message, which obviously influences how we go about presenting ourselves to others. It's all very well finding a way of presenting ourselves to other people that will attract them, but it's also got to represent us. And this is also a point of dispute within the church. So in the first part of this talk, I want to explore the question of whether symbols put people off the church or attract them to it. And then I will say something about Catholic culture and the church's message. The idea that modern people don't want complex symbols is a powerful and persistent idea. And to understand what makes this idea attractive and what sort of assumptions or worldviews lies behind it, I want to approach it through the ideas of an influential proponent of this view, and one who is, with whom I have a great deal of sympathy, the Catholic anthropologist Mary Douglas. Her classic treatment of this subject is her 1966 book, Natural Symbols, so 1966, right on the button. This book was quoted by Michael Davis for her amusing observation about the abolition of Friday abstinence. Douglas wrote, "It is as if the liturgical signal boxes were manned by color-blind signalmen." This was because, in her view, Friday abstinence was such a powerful symbol for working-class Catholics, or, as she calls them, ironically, the Borg Irish. So I think her idea here is to defend the group of people who are often patronizingly dismissed as the Borg Irish. But there's a whole chapter with that title in her book. In the same discussion, however, Douglas proposed that this kind of Catholic was in decline. And as time went on, Western society was going to be increasingly dominated by non-symbolic, or at least symbol-light, culture. The symbols of religious culture, Douglas argues, make sense to people to whom symbols make sense. People who are not brought up with lots of symbols will struggle to understand or appreciate them. In traditional families, children grow up used to the ritual of family meals, the symbol of the paterfamilias sitting at the head of the table, and the family hierarchy that this implies. By the time she was writing in 1966, this was in decline, because more and more people, starting with what we might call the smart set, were eschewing such symbols and downplaying or rejecting social structures such as family meals, the rituals of Christmas, and even marriage and family as traditionally conceived. Thus, we can expect new generations to find symbols harder to understand and appreciate. Douglas compared the two kinds of Western culture, one heavily reliant on symbols and one not, to the contrast between two cultures studied by anthropologists in the Congo. Nomadic pygmies, on the one hand, and the settled farmers of the same region. The pygmies, as she explained, have minimal social structures. They do their hunting and gathering in bands, but leadership is not well defined, and individuals frequently move from one band to another. There is very little, if any, specialization of function. Family structures are also very loose. Religion is very minimally organized and involves practically no religious personnel or ritual. The farmers, on the other hand, though living nearby, have all the things I've just mentioned that the pygmies lack, including a ritualized religious culture characterized, according to Douglas, by intense, ecstatic religious experience. So this is one of the things she associates with a highly ritualized kind of religion. Douglas makes the connection with the theological movement of her own time, such as the notoriously heterodox post-Vatican II Dutch Catechism. So she writes, I quote, "The doctrine of the transformation of the bread into the divine body is played down, and the other modes of Christ's presence, particularly the word, is played up. They can't take it, the Dutch bishops who issued this catechism, and the open-minded English teachers who seized on it as a watered-down expression of a faith that has practically lost meaning for them. The mystery of the Eucharist is too dazzlingly magical for their impoverished symbolic perception. Like the pygmies, I say it again, since they often seem to pride themselves on having reached some high point of intellectual development, they cannot conceive of the deity as located in any one thing or place." Unquote. So I like bringing Douglas into this because she's essentially on our side, but she's saying something which is quite depressing, if it's true. So Douglas is clearly correct that the rising generation of the middle classes of the 1960s rejected many traditional symbols. And this process has indeed dissolved important aspects of our culture, particularly around marriage and the family. This is clearly downstream of an Enlightenment rejection of obscurantism and inherited customs, that is to say, Enlightenment rationalism. What is not so clear, however, are two questions. First, were the 1960s middle-class people rejecting all symbolism or swapping one set of symbols for another? Second, are their children and grandchildren incapable of appreciating symbols today? Rationalists since the 18th century have rejected the very rich symbolism of the Catholic Church, but the leading lights of this movement have been writers, philosophers, and artists whose entire lives were spent in creating and manipulating symbols. They were not about to start living like pygmies, which would, in any case, have been pretty difficult in Northern Europe, and industrialization was moving Western societies further away from the hunter-gatherer model at a rapid pace, with greater and greater specialization. The formalization of education, the professionalization of many disciplines, and the rise of the bureaucratic state all created new hierarchies. My own thoughts on this process, which I have developed elsewhere, is that while the ideology of rationalism rejects tradition and hierarchy, the implementation of this program was actually pretty superficial. We see the destruction of Catholic traditions because the rationalists didn't like their content, but at the same time, rationalists were building their own traditions, less beautiful, less humane, and less useful, but traditions all the same. The decline of religion in the West, at least among intellectuals, was not a matter of coming to believe in nothing at all. Still less was it about adopting the diffuse animistic pantheism, which an anthropologist like Mary Douglas might regard as the form of religion that corresponds to a non-hierarchical and non-symbolic society. In reality, religion was often rejected in the West, but in favor of a highly symbolic ideology, such as scientism, communism, militarism, or theosophy, the last of these being the ancestor of the New Age movement. Having said that, I would concede two things to Mary Douglas's thesis. One is that the culture developed first by the Enlightenment and then by the cultural crisis of the 1960s is, at any rate, less traditional and less focused on symbols than the European cultures that went before. Indeed, many of the traditions and symbols of the Enlightenment itself were subsequently rejected by their own descendants. My second concession is that this new culture was not equally well suited to different parts of society. It was created by intellectuals and doesn't work well for less educated people. This contrasts with Christian culture, which has a remarkable ability to transform the whole of society and find a place for every kind of person. With the destruction of the traditional culture of the West, we find important parts of society with the bare minimum in the way of culture. So, what are people of today? If the leading figures of the 1960s rejected so much of the symbolism and hierarchy of Western culture, what is the attitude of their descendants 2 generations later? Young adults today have certainly been educated to reject the Christian message and to despise hierarchy. But modern culture can go in a number of different directions. Consider the concept of a chosen family. This is the family substitute rebellious young people choose for themselves in place of their boring old parents and other blood relations. If you think that choice and consent are key concepts in morality and the proper basis for personal identity, as many people do, then a chosen family has greater legitimacy and authenticity than a biological family. It is the ultimate negation of inherited culture. Most commonly, a chosen family is adopted when a young person identifies as homosexual or transsexual or with some other identity politics tribe and transfers his allegiance from biological family to exciting new friends in one of these so-called communities. This is the point of adopting a chosen family, to join a community, a tribe, and to adopt an identity. The adoption of chosen families is a phenomenon of a society in which biological families and their culture have been radically weakened, and it is clear that in many cases the young people involved are not moving from an overly rigid, stifling family culture with dense networks of relationships and a limited number of acceptable life pathways to something more liberal and open. On the contrary, they are moving from a family that is weak, perhaps to the point of being non-functional, and which has failed to give them a secure place in a wider community or a sense of identifiable and valorized life options. And what they have adopted instead is much more rigid and demanding, offering a tightly knit community built around a highly specific way of life. Now you're in the gang, chum, here are the rules. What are the mainstream middle-class culture? Is this all open-minded with a flattened hierarchy and few symbols? On the contrary, thanks to the developments, especially since about 2010, we find in the higher echelons of the professional classes a highly stratified symbolic culture of such complexity that it would make a Byzantine court eunuch's head spin. Indeed, it is becoming clear that only people with a high level of education, preferably those who have been brought up to it in the right kind of prosperous, super-liberal culture, can successfully navigate the intricacies of the woke academic world, the higher reaches of woke corporations, or much of the public sector. In a slightly different way, the Mother's online discussion forum, Mumsnet, is strewn with unmentionable topics and forbidden opinions, as are many Facebook special interest groups. Such is the investment needed to be a successful part of these worlds, and such are the rewards for those who manage it, that their denizens have been called cultural capitalists, people who turn cultural assets into a living, just as artists and intellectuals have done down the centuries. In the modern marketplace of cultural capitalism, the less intellectually agile will sooner or later blurt out the wrong pronouns, wave an obsolete version of the pride flag, mistake the order of precedence in the hierarchy of victimhood, or break some other unwritten rule. Those who do so often face a terrible defenestration. If you think that the 613 rules of the Torah identified by Orthodox Jews or the umpteen ways a priest can commit a mortal sin when celebrating Mass are a bit demanding, you should consider the ways a liberal intellectual can be cancelled. They are as numberless as the stars of heaven, but unlike the stars, they change every 6 months. Furthermore, in many of these communities, there is no absolution and no forgiveness for transgressors. The blood of heifers and of goats will avail you nothing. We can laugh at this stuff, and indeed we must laugh at it, but to repeat, this is not a marginal phenomenon. The woke people have created a new culture of staggering complexity and brutally enforced rules and established its hegemony at the center of Western society. The anti-hierarchical, anti-symbolic social model, insofar as it was ever real, has now failed in its heartlands among the very people that Mary Douglas thought were most suited to it. An unlovely illustration of the new culture is the race to dinner phenomenon in the USA, in which two anti-racist activists, Regina Jackson and Sarah Rao, are paid $2,500. This is all true, I read it in The Guardian. Plus, they're paid $2,500 plus their dinner to tell 8 white women who have volunteered and have often paid to be part of this, that they, the women, are irredeemably racist. The women are challenged, they confess their guilt, they weep. It's a secularized version of some kind of 17th century religious mania. It's the perfect kind of ecstatic religiosity that Mary Douglas thought we were leaving behind because of the liberalization and the flattening of hierarchies and all that stuff. Now, this is obviously not everyone does this race to dinner madness, but in fact, this is just the extreme end of a huge phenomenon which has left very, very few schools, even in this country, untouched. And in that way, it touches almost every family in the land. To pull the threads together in this part of the discussion, it is obviously true that many aspects of Christian culture were destroyed for great swathes of society in the course of the 20th century, leaving many people lacking cultural resources that are still required for a psychologically and materially comfortable life in a complex society, such as a sense of identity and a secure place in a community. The woke elite don't have this problem because they have adopted a new, highly symbolic culture, but this is incapable of expanding to include all the classes of society, unlike traditional religious cultures. And in this, it is even worse than earlier versions of post-Enlightenment elite culture. At its most successful, this new culture is cruel, ugly, and vapid. It excludes vast swathes of society as a sort of massa damnata, or basket of deplorables, and at regular intervals it casts into outer darkness the most intelligent and independent-minded members of its own elite. The situation is certainly grim, but in terms of evangelizing opportunities, although there are many complicating factors, our current cultural situation represents a wide open door for the church. The opportunity here is colossal. It is high time we notice the way that things have turned out. I get the impression that many people in the church are still convinced that modern society is characterized by people who are perfectly content to be cultureless, atomized individuals, and who are thoroughly put off, for example, by something as old-fashioned as people genuflecting to the Blessed Sacrament. In reality, The unconverted world is dominated by two overlapping groups of people: the ones who genuflect to Black Lives Matter and the ones who are looking for something more worthy of veneration. At this point, I turn to the question of the church's own culture. In the middle of the 20th century, the church was subject to the same winds of change as other institutions. I have written elsewhere in more detail about the factors driving disaffiliation from the church, which come down to a series of things that increased the influence on Catholics of ideas hostile to the faith, notably radio and television, the expansion of higher education, war damage, slum clearance and suburbanization disrupting Catholic communities, war service and migration. These factors, as at the same time or a bit later, had a similar effect on culinary traditions, minority languages, all sorts of membership organizations, and practically every institution and practice that created and embodied social capital. The concept of social capital was popularized by Robert Putnam in his seminal book, Bowling Alone, which was published in 2000, which is all about its decline since the 1960s. He writes that the phrase, and I quote, refers to connections among individuals, social networks, and the norms of reciprocity and trustworthiness that arise from them, unquote. Having a circle of friends and a wider circle of people you know and trust, chatting over the garden fence, hosting dinner parties, attending card-playing circles, amateur sports, volunteering, church-going, all these things, Putnam tells us, makes people more economically productive and happier, and all took a terrible knock from the factors I just listed. People stopped getting their ideas from their neighbors, from their card-playing chums, and they started getting their ideas from the television. It cut them off from their neighbors. As the crisis developed, it was young people who were most exposed to these influences, and the church was faced by them, raising the young people, raising new questions about the faith and its practices, and being less willing to come to Mass, to marry within the church, and in general to maintain the church as a social and supernatural reality. This was interpreted by many in the church as the opening offer in a negotiation. Young Catholics, they thought, could be persuaded to remain in the fold if the price was not so high. If the church insisted less on the difficult teachings, abolished Friday abstinence, frowned less on the marrying outside the church, accepted that some people would only attend Mass once a month, and so on. This was a mistake, however. The questions and the general reluctance to the line were the result of newly powerful outside influences countering the habits and influences which had ensured that previous generations of young Catholics had maintained the practice of the faith. The effect of the liberalizing concessions offered by the Church was to expose young Catholics to still more outside influences and still less to countervailing influences from within the community and the tradition, which could have been the sources of answers to their questions and sources of motivations for sticking to the faith. For this reason, they directly accelerated the process of disaffiliation. You may wonder where the destruction of the ancient liturgy fits into all this. I am not someone who attributes all the Church's woes to the liturgical reform. Clearly, the reform can't explain the massive decline of membership of the Freemasons, to take just one example at random, and a whole lot of other membership organizations and social activities which followed a very similar trajectory to the decline of church membership among Catholics. Whatever caused problems for other communities must have had an effect on the Church as well. It doesn't follow that the reform was insignificant, however, and it is easy to see what its influence was. We can see in the letters pages of the Catholic press in the 1960s and from the diaries and biographies of Catholics who lived through reform that it had a shattering effect on a huge number of people who felt disoriented, alienated from the Church, and deprived of a marker of identity that has served to unite the Catholic community. The reality, indeed, is acknowledged and regretted by many proponents of the reform who hoped that things would settle down when people got used to the new liturgy. The problem is that apart from anything more theologically or spiritually profound, the new liturgy was much less distinctive as a marker of identity for Catholics against Protestantism, against secularism, and against modernity than the old Mass had been, and was so by design. It fitted into a wider post-conciliar policy of making concessions to the very influences that were dismantling the Catholic Church as a human community. I need to stress this wider point because a lot turns on it and it is very fiercely contested. We are endlessly told that the Church, and no doubt other institutions, would have fared even worse in the course of the crisis of the 1960s if she had not made concessions, following the advice of Aesop's fable of the reed and the oak tree in the storm. The oak is uprooted and the reed survives. The problem, however, is that the nature of the concessions being made. Reactionary as I am, I don't think the Church should have forbidden people to travel by car or refused to engage with television or later the internet. The Church has to reach people where they are. We can all agree on that. What needs to be hammered home is that sanctioning changes that reduce the influence of the liturgy, the patrimony of Catholic art, literature and thought, and of the Catholic community itself over people on the brink of disaffiliation is like treating blood loss with a course of bloodletting, as happened to the wounded after the Battle of Waterloo. This is what happened when the Jesuits moved their seminaries from the countryside to the cities, when teachers in Catholic schools were no longer required to be Catholic, when bishops failed to support Catholic newspapers, radio stations, and television initiatives, when restrictions on Catholics attending non-Catholic religious services were loosened, when the importance of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the saints, and in our country, the martyrs of penal times was minimized, when devotional art was stripped out of churches, when specifically Catholic devotions like benediction and the Rosary were discouraged, when Latin ceased to be taught in Catholic schools and seminaries, when secular music styles replaced chant in the liturgy, when Catholics were encouraged to seek spiritual wisdom from Protestant, Orthodox, or pagan sources, when the traditional Mass was suppressed, and so on and on and on. Some of these decisions could be defended in isolation. Some were motivated by practical considerations. The problem is that every one of them pulled in the same direction, and there was no systematic attempt to counter their inevitable effect, the effect, I mean, of detaching Catholics from their own cultural patrimony, and even from their co-religionists. The consequences were entirely predictable, and no one is entitled to be surprised to see them duly come to pass. Catholics detached from the church community and from the practice of the faith are more likely to lapse. Catholics who are part of a strong Catholic community with Catholic role models and fellow Catholics they can talk to in perplexity, Catholics in touch with the resources of Catholic art, literature, and the intellectual life, Catholics whose spiritual lives are fed by specifically Catholic devotional practices and informed by Catholic spiritual martyrs, these are obviously going to be less susceptible to the siren songs of secularism, Protestantism, and sinful lifestyles than Catholics who do not have those things. It is not that all the things brought in from outside the church, the Catholic tradition, be it music or art or ideas, are necessarily bad in themselves. Each can be considered on its merits. The problem I'm drawing attention to here is simply that they don't tie you into a Catholic culture. They won't stop people from disaffiliating from something of which they are not themselves part. The response of the Church to the cultural crisis of the 1960s was then a huge and tragic mistake. To be fair to our predecessors in the faith, the same mistake was being made by a great many cultural institutions at the time, and one reason for this was that factors pulling people away from the faith and other traditions were having their effect on the people thinking up and implementing institutional responses to those pressures. Bishops, priests, Catholic school teachers and parents, no less than secular politicians and museum directors and all the rest, were reading the newspapers and watching TV. Many of them were convinced by the commentators of the time of the inevitability of teenage rebellion, despite this being a phenomenon different in kind from anything in previous recorded history. They were also soaking up the idea that the old order was unreasonably restrictive and needed to be radically reshaped, despite the fact that the social norms of the 1950s were vastly more easygoing than those of previous eras. It is not just the wisdom of hindsight to point out that the Church should have examined each proposed change to discern carefully if it was going to serve the good of souls. This was literally what was demanded by Vatican II on the liturgical front in Sacrosanctum Concilium section 23. And this policy was actually carried out by a Christian religious community that survived the storm better than most, the American Amish. We can disagree as much as we like with the Amish, but they have been richly rewarded for their caution. Far from collapsing, like liberal Christian denominations, the Amish population is currently doubling in size approximately every 20 years. Unfortunately, in the 1960s and since, thinking within the Church about the nature of Catholic culture and community has been remarkably confused. Indeed, those two words have become strangely opposed to each other. The word community has taken on a liberal colouring. For example, liturgical practices that play down the sacrificial nature of the Mass, or what is called the vertical orientation of the liturgy, its evocation of the transcendent and its sense of addressing itself to God, are defended as emphasizing instead the horizontal or community aspect of the liturgy. The word culture, by contrast, has an elitist colouring, and the phrase Catholic culture seems to be used only by conservative and traditionalist Catholics. It has become associated with the culture of the past, and the people of the present and of the future are assumed to reject all that stuff because, in accordance with the Mary Douglas thesis already discussed, modern people don't like symbols and hierarchy, supposedly. What the trendsetters in the Church thought they were doing was toning down the symbols and hierarchy to make the Church more acceptable to people who didn't like symbols and hierarchy. What they expected to happen was for these cultureless people somehow to form communities without culture, bound together only by the creed and sacraments. This hasn't happened, because no community can exist without a culture. Indeed, those parts of our society which really have lost their culture can no longer be described as communities, because a sense of solidarity, mutual understanding, and trust become possible only in the context of markers of identity and a common way of life. The Catholic community was battered by the things that affected practically everyone in the 1960s, but our own leadership went to extraordinary lengths to make it worse than it needed to have been. Today, we have an elite culture far more complicated in its own way than the traditional hierarchies and symbols left behind in the 1960s. Not everyone has been able to get on board with this new culture, but those left behind do not embrace their new world without symbols as a blessed liberation. Rather, they have found themselves in a bleak and friendless wasteland. This is all to say that the traditional culture of the Church was never as off-putting as many claimed it was in the 1960s, and today, when the cultural scene has had another 60 years or so to develop, it is clear that it is powerfully attractive to a great many people who are searching for meaning. The Church certainly has the problem that its own culture is not manifested in an attractive way in a great many church buildings, Catholic publications, or indeed Catholic individuals. It is manifested very beautifully in the traditional Mass, and this is the point of hope for the Church. If we want to make the most of the evangelizing opportunity that I've been talking about, however, we need two things. First, we have to be aware of the differences between the values of Catholic culture and the values of the various forms of non-Catholic culture which may influence the people who are attracted to the faith. It is one thing to be attracted by symbols, it is another thing to accept the worldview that they are expressing. The awareness seems to be easier in the context of traditional Mass than it is in many mainstream Catholic settings. Indeed, it is becoming a cliché that people who have come into the Church under the influence of traditional Mass are more theologically orthodox than cradle Catholics. Second, the people who are attracted to the Catholic faith today are often people who lack a functioning community that can offer them support or a sense of identity. This is a psychological need and a social need, and as I have been arguing, it is also a fact that Catholic evangelizers cannot show off Catholic culture if there is no Catholic community which actually lives it. This brings us back to the supposed contrast between community and culture. Liberal Catholics who talk endlessly about community don't seem to be very good at building a community up. Church services which are all about holding hands and emoting have not made Protestant communities strong and resilient, and they don't work for us either. I was struck by a remark of Stott Hahn in the full version of the interview he did for the Mass of the Ages trilogy, which is available to their supporters on their website, and I quote, so this is Stott Hahn speaking ex-tempore, "Why would we want anthropocentric and communal first and foremost, and not be theocentric and focus as a community on the glory and majesty of God? Nothing will form a community that is tighter and more devout and will become holy more than being God-centered." End quote. A community needs a shared set of symbols, values, and sense of identity. In other words, a culture. These things are much more to be found in young and growing traditional Mass congregations than in the aging and collapsing congregations of liberal Anglican parishes and those Catholic parishes that most resemble them. A community without a culture is impossible, because a shared culture is what distinguishes a community from, say, the people who happen to be stuck in the same traffic jam. What we can learn from books or see in museums may inspire our work of restoring culture, but a living culture cannot exist without a community that lives it, and it is to a living culture that people must be attracted if they are to come to the church. The church's culture is the church's witness to her own beliefs. But we don't encounter these as naked creedal formulas. Rather, the forms of life of a community, its customs and practices, are shaped and inspired by the ideas, and this is why it is possible to have different national and regional Catholic cultures, with the same idea being manifested culturally in different ways. From what I have said in the first half of this presentation, it is apparent that there is a hunger for a community in the sense of a network of individuals capable of giving its members a sense of identity and moral and practical support. This is a natural rather than a supernatural reality, and the Catholic Church can do much more for people than this. But that fact should not distract us from the fact that the Church can do this as well. This is indeed a necessary function of any community, including a Christian one. Christ established a church to evangelize the world, not simply a book or a set of ideas, and the church as a community can pass on the faith in the way that communities pass on their values, both to new generations and to adults who come under their influence through the natural means of community ties and the passing on of human culture. If we accept that this is true, the next step is to accept that the natural human aspect of the church as a community has to be established by natural and human means, shared symbols and shared experiences, shared attitudes and ways of life, and meeting and getting to know each other. It is God's way, as we see in the history of salvation, to use both natural and supernatural means for the same ends. The natural protection offered to Our Lady and the infant Saviour by St. Joseph as the father of a family might seem wholly inadequate to the task of warding off the threat posed by King Herod, but it is not for that reason set aside. Instead, it was made adequate to the task by supernatural assistance. For every generation, the natural process by which children are influenced by their parents and by the other people to whom they look up to in the community is the natural means by which the faith is passed on. the natural advantages, materially and psychologically, of having a sense of identity, of having a network of friends, of seeing examples of lifestyle choices, both good and bad, are part of what it means for the church to be a visible human institution. We have been living through a time when this human institution has declined in its strength and coherence, and this has had direct and calamitous effects on the effectiveness of the church's divine mission. To be able to evangelize, we must restore the church as a community with a distinctive Catholic culture. I would like to end with this thought. I'm sure no one listening to this will disagree that strong communities like motherhood and apple pie are a good thing. The question is whether we are prepared to do the things that actually strengthen our communities. This is a question that bishops, head teachers of our schools, parish priests, and parents all have to answer. Are you prepared to go the extra mile to bring back markers of Catholic identity, to restore Catholic devotions, to have grace before meals and statues of the saints and recognizable traditional church architecture and all the other obvious things? It is also a question for us as individuals. Are we prepared to spend the time and effort strengthening the bonds among Catholics? This is a particular problem today because many mass congregations are too small to fulfill members' needs for community. We have to think about restoring the dense networks that once existed between Catholics on a regional, national, and international level, such as are fostered by the work of the Latin Mass Society. At this moment in the history of the Church, this work is more important than ever.